The cat kept staring at the wall. What we discovered was scary. Have you ever seen a cat staring into space and wondered what it was seeing? Now imagine if that stare hid something much more frightening. That's what happened to us. At first, we thought it was just a strange habit of our cat, Max, but then came the noises. And what we discovered behind that wall changed everything. At first we thought it was a passing fad, but Max didn't stop. Always at the same time, always at the same point. As if he was waiting for something. Max was a curious cat and might just be observing something that our eyes couldn't see, maybe a tiny insect, a reflection of light, even a wisp of dust floating in the air. But then the days passed, and his fixation didn't lessen, and then the noises started. It was something so subtle that it almost went unnoticed. Low, almost imperceptible sounds, like a light scratch coming from inside the wall. At first, we thought it was all in our heads, some noise that had always been there and that we had only just noticed. But when the nights came, the sounds became clearer. Little pops, short scratches, sometimes even a hollow sound, as if something is moving inside the wall. Max figured it out before we did. He flinched slightly, his ears moved toward the sound, and his eyes opened even wider. Its tail was low and rigid. He wasn't just curious, he was scared. What, after all, was happening? There? It all started when the family moved to an old house, built more than 50 years ago, located in a quiet neighborhood in a small American town. There was nothing imposing or macabre about the structure. It was a simple residence with walls marked by time, but which exuded a certain nostalgic charm. Max, the house cat, has always been recognized for his playful nature and innate curiosity. On the first day, while the new residents explored every corner of the residence, Max also dedicated himself to investigating the corners of the house, jumping from room to room with the typical energy of an uninhibited feline. That same first night, when the house was beginning to settle into silence and darkness, something unusual caught the attention of the residents. Max, who during the day had shown himself to be the picture of vivacity, suddenly changed his behavior. Instead of curling up in some comfortable corner or chasing shadows, he calmly walked to the center of the room and positioned himself facing a wall for no apparent reason. Max's fixed, almost hypnotic gaze, as he stared at that lifeless surface, aroused an inexplicable curiosity. At first, residents found the scene curious and even amusing, considering that cats tend to have peculiar behaviors. After all, who has never witnessed a cat focused on something that seemed to be just a reflection or a passing shadow? They thought that perhaps Max had detected the presence of a small insect, or that a play of lights had created an illusion that only he could see. However, as they got closer, they realized that there was absolutely nothing extraordinary on the wall that could justify that fixed and attentive look. The following day, the household's routine seemed to have settled into some normality, but something remained unsettling. Just like the previous night, Max returned to position himself in the same part of the room, with the same enigmatic posture and the same penetrating gaze. It was always at the same time, as if the cat had some kind of ritual or silent commitment to that place. Residents began to notice that regardless of changes in his daily routine, Max invariably headed for the wall, demonstrating a patience that contrasted with his usual energy and agility. It was impossible not to notice the intensity of that behavior. Each day, Max's fixation became more evident, and the residents began to wonder if there was something beyond what met the eye. That fixed look, repeated tirelessly, seemed to be the only constant thing amidst the changes that the new home brought. Thus, the house, previously just a welcoming home, began to take on a tone of mystery, encouraging residents to seek explanations for that singular behavior. The connection between the house's old ambiance and Max's unusual attitude was something that slowly began to emerge in the residents' minds. The atmosphere of that residence, with its silent murmurs and corners that held memories of decades past, seemed to create the perfect setting for something inexplicable to occur. And Max, with his almost vigilant stance, seemed to be the link that united the present with what had been forgotten over the years. That repetition, Max's insistence on remaining faithful to his fixed point, raised a question that, in a subtle way, began to hover in the air. Was the feline waiting for something? Or was it that the house itself was trying to communicate something? Through that behavior, the routine was established, but the restlessness in Max's eyes did not dissipate, fueling the mystery that was beginning to take root in that ancient and silent environment. In this way, what was initially seen as a simple eccentricity became the beginning of a mystery that would unfold in the following days, involving the hidden history of that house and the secrets it kept. Max's insistence began to awaken a strange feeling of discomfort in the residents. They tried to ignore it, to rationalize the situation, but it was impossible not to notice that something seemed wrong. It was as if the cat's behavior carried a meaning that no one could decipher. As the days passed, something else began to become evident. Whenever Max approached the wall, the temperature of the room seemed to change. At first, it was something subtle, a slight feeling of cold that could easily be attributed to the climate in the house or drafts. But then the phenomenon became more noticeable. It was a dry, intense cold, which appeared suddenly and disappeared in the same way with no apparent explanation. At first, residents tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just an impression, an irrelevant detail that the human mind was exaggerating because of Max's strange obsession. Friends who passed by the house commented on the change in temperature. Some even involuntarily shivered as they passed by the place. "There's something strange here," they said. The inevitable question began to arise. Why did Max keep staring at that wall? And why did that cold feeling always seem to accompany him when he was there? Without answers, residents began to avoid that corner of the house. What was once just an ordinary wall now carried an aura of discomfort, as if somehow the space had acquired an invisible weight. But Max was still there, night after night, motionless, patient. And then the night came when something happened. The house was immersed in the silence of the early morning when an unexpected sound echoed throughout the room. It was a low noise, almost imperceptible at first, something that could easily be mistaken for the creak of ancient wood settling with the night's temperature. But soon came another sound, and then another. It wasn't just pops, they were scratches, faint at first, as if something was scraping against the wall structure, trying to move within it. The sound was irregular, hesitant, but unmistakable. Max, as always, was there before anyone could even notice. But this time, he wasn't just watching. His body was stiff, his breathing was labored, and his tail moved in short spasms, clear signs that he was on high alert. The house, which until then had only been a setting for that mystery, suddenly seemed to be reacting, as if something that had always been there was beginning to reveal itself. Around 2 in the morning, the house plunged into the absolute silence of dawn. There was no noise other than the distant sound of the wind outside, rushing through the trees and lightly rattling the windows. Everything seemed calm until a faint, almost imperceptible sound broke the stillness. It came from that same wall. The residents woke up in fright, their senses sharpened by the discomfort of that silent hour. At first, they remained motionless, just listening. The house remained dark. The digital clock blinked on the bedside table, showing exactly 2:03 a.m. The sound, which had previously seemed distant, was now there, present, filling every corner of the room with a growing uneasiness. Residents tried to rationalize. Perhaps it was an old pipe making unusual sounds during the early hours of the morning. Perhaps a small animal, a mouse or a squirrel, was trapped inside the structure of the house. But as the mind sought logical explanations, the body reacted differently. The feeling of cold returned, moving through the room like an invisible breeze. The air felt heavier, as if it were charged with something that shouldn't be there. The sounds stopped after a few minutes. Max remained in the same position for a long time, but eventually backed away, without taking his eyes off the wall. The house returned to silence, but from that night onwards, the pattern repeated itself. At exactly 2 in the morning every night, the noises returned, sometimes weak, sometimes more intense. Scratches, sharp knocks, something that seemed to move inside that structure as if looking for a way out, and every night without fail, Max was there, waiting. The mystery, which before was just a curiosity, now became something impossible to ignore. Something was wrong in that house, something that somehow had always been there, waiting for the right moment to be noticed. Deciding to investigate, the residents started with the basics. They grabbed flashlights and examined the surface of the wall for any irregularities, a crack, a small hole, any indication that there was anything inside the structure. They knocked on different points to listen to the sound of wood and plaster, trying to identify any difference that would indicate a hollow space or some type of hidden passage. But at first, everything seemed solid. The wall, apparently, was just an ordinary wall. Even so, Max's insistence and persistent noises said otherwise. If there was something there, it was hidden in a way that the eyes could not perceive. It was then that they decided to do a test, position a camera in the room, pointed directly at the wall, and leave it recording overnight. Perhaps, with a little luck, they would be able to record some movement or sound that would clarify the mystery. That night, the tension seemed greater. Even though I didn't know what to expect, there was a strange sense of anticipation in the air. When the clock struck 2 in the morning, everyone was alert, waiting for what had already become a disturbing routine. Max was in his usual place, sitting in front of the wall, his gaze fixed and motionless, as if waiting for something. And, like other nights, the noises started. Scratches, clicks, a hollow sound coming from inside the structure. This time, however, the difference was that everything was being recorded. The next morning, with some apprehension, residents gathered to review the recording. The first few hours quickly advanced until the screen showed the exact moment Max approached the wall. Around 2:30 a.m., he remained there motionless as he did every night. But then, at a certain point, something strange happened. Without warning, Max suddenly backed away, as if startled. His body arched, his tail puffed out, and he jumped a few steps back, keeping his eyes wide in the same direction. It was a quick, instinctive movement, as if he had reacted to something unexpected. Seconds later, a dry sound echoed through the recording. Something hit inside the wall. The villagers froze as they watched. The sound was clear, strong enough to be picked up by the camera, and didn't sound like the subtle scratches they had heard before. It felt firm, like an impact against wood or in plaster. But what was even more disturbing was the exact timing of the event. Max was startled by the noise. He reacted before anything could be heard. This couldn't be a simple coincidence. Whatever was in there seemed to be reacting to the cat's presence. The evidence captured on the recording was the turning point. The first step was to call a professional to evaluate the wall structure. Perhaps there was a rational explanation, a problem with the plumbing, a construction flaw, an animal that had somehow found its way inside the house. The specialist arrived the next day, bringing equipment that could detect hidden leaks and assess the integrity of the structure without having to immediately damage it. He examined the wall meticulously, testing different spots, analyzing the sound of the knocks against the plaster and wood. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then, as he passed the scanner over a specific area, he frowned. There was something there, something that shouldn't be. Bluntly, he confirmed that the reading indicated a hollow space within the wall. The curious thing was that that compartment did not correspond to any known feature of the house. There were no records of renovations that would justify the existence of a hidden cavity. That space simply shouldn't exist. With that in mind, there were no longer any doubts. They needed to open the wall. The process began carefully, first removing a part of the coating, revealing the wood and plaster that formed the internal structure. With each layer removed, anticipation grew. Max remained nearby the entire time, watching intently, as if he knew they were about to discover something important. And then, when they finally exposed the hidden cavity, what they found made the air in the room feel heavier. Inside, carefully hidden inside the small compartment, was an old package covered in dust and aged with time. The fabric surrounding it was frayed and fragile, as if it hadn't been touched for decades. It was clear that someone had put it there on purpose, hiding it as if they wanted it never to be found. The residents removed the package with shaking hands. Inside it, they found a collection of old photographs, some letters yellowed with age, and at the bottom, a leather-bound diary also aged. That wall didn't just hold a forgotten space. She was hiding a story. And upon opening that diary, they began to understand exactly what Max seemed to know all along. The photos inside the package were faded with age, but you could still make out the faces in them. They were images of a family that decades before had lived in that same house. Serious faces, formal dresses, typical poses from a time when photographs were rare and valued. Some of the images showed rooms that still existed in the house, although the furniture and decor were completely different. Next to the photos was a bundle of old letters, all addressed to a woman named Clara. The pages were yellowed, some stained with moisture, but the words were still legible. The tone of the letters varied. Some were affectionate, others more urgent, as if they were written in the midst of growing concern. The writing was elegant, typical of times gone by, and each envelope bore marks of time, old seals and stamps, that indicated dates from decades ago. At the bottom of the package, a leather-bound diary rested, its material dried by time but still solid. Upon leafing through it, they realized it belonged to a man named Edward. As the pages turned, his notes revealed an increasingly disturbing account. In the beginning, he wrote about the routine in the house, trivial details of everyday life. But as they progressed, the words began to change tone. Edward described sounds coming from inside the walls, noises he couldn't explain. At first, he tried to convince himself that it was just the wood of the house settling, common noises from an old building. But then, the notes began to reflect a more unsettling tone. He talked about the constant feeling of being watched, as if there was something in the house that he couldn't see, but that was always there. And then the most disturbing detail emerged. He mentioned a cat. Each night he stands still, looking at the same place, like he's seeing something I can't see. At that moment, a shiver ran through our bodies. It was as if Max was showing us something that had always been there, waiting to be discovered. The need for answers led them to seek more information about the house's former residents. They researched records, looked through the city's old archives, trying to understand who the people were who once lived there. It was then that they discovered something even more disturbing. Edward had mysteriously disappeared. There were no records of him leaving the house, no indication that he had moved. It was as if, at a certain point, he had simply ceased to exist, and Clara, the woman to whom the letters were written, was never found. There was no information about her whereabouts, nor any record that explained what happened to her. His name was on the old papers, but other than that, it was as if he had disappeared without a trace. For years, the history of that house had been forgotten. Nobody talked about the previous residents, and life went on without anyone questioning what really happened there, until Max brings it all to the surface. After that discovery, things changed. The house, which for weeks had been filled with a heavy and unsettling atmosphere, seemed different. The noises stopped. The nights were silent again. And Max, whose obsession with the wall had been the center of that whole mystery, never showed the same behavior again. He still walked around the house, still explored every corner as he always did, but he never stopped in front of that wall like before. It was as if he had somehow fulfilled a purpose, as if he had revealed a secret that had been buried for decades. And now that everything had been discovered, there was no longer any reason to continue there, watching. This experience brought an inevitable question. Cats have much more acute senses than humans. Your hearing is capable of capturing frequencies that we would never perceive. Your eyes see in light levels that would be total darkness to us. But would that be it? Or is there something beyond? Something we can't fully understand? What did Max notice on that wall? Did he sense something that had been there all along, waiting to be discovered? And somehow, by taking us to that diary and those letters, he freed a story that needed to be told? After that, they never doubted a cat's instinct again. And how many similar stories could be happening out there, unnoticed? How many forgotten secrets could be revealed if we paid more attention to the behavior of our animals? And you? Have you ever experienced something similar to your cat? Has he ever reacted to something you couldn't see or understand? If he could talk, what would he say? Share your story in the comments. If this story intrigued you, just wait until you hear the next one. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.